Welcome everybody to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. And I'm your host, Isaac Levin. If you're enjoying the interviews here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you're interested or know any folks that would be interested in coming on and chatting, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle there is IsaacR11, or you can reach out to me on Mastodon. My handle there is IsaacR11 at fossadon.org. So, with that out of the way, let's get right into our conversation. I'm looking forward to it. We've chatted out on the speaker circuit, and it's good to get an hour of his time. So, I'm really excited for my chat today with Corey Weathers. Corey, do you want to say hello, introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for hanging out with us for at least this next hour. My name is Corey Weathers. I have the privilege and pleasure of serving as a developer relations lead for our team at Off Zero, which is obviously owned by Okta these days. And so I'm super excited to be able to be with you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited too. I think this is going to be a good chat. We were talking before, and I said, "Let's stop. We gotta like have some good conversation actually on stream." And how I love to start my conversations with folks, Corey, is I think everybody in tech, like, we had this origin story, like this point in time when we realized that technology was this really cool thing, and we wanted to be a part of the experience. And do you remember that point in time for you when technology was like, "Hey, Corey, like, this is the thing. You should do this thing."
Yeah, I remember sort of two moments, which is it's kind of weird because they're not exactly close in time frame. One is I remember, so I grew up in poverty, right? Like there was
Sure.
a bunch of us. We grew up in public housing in Brooklyn, and I remember the first time we got a computer, and
Yeah.
this somewhat predates the internet,
Hmm.
but I remember because we'd gotten a computer, my dad being very controlling about making sure that we didn't break the computer.
Yeah.
And I remember my fascination with it, which led to me getting into trouble a lot because I kept
Hmm.
doing things to try to like open
Yeah.
up and understand how things worked and all the things. But that fascination has never gone away. It is still with me today, which I find really interesting. The second moment for me was uh, I was 17 years old. And at that time, I was trying to figure out what I was going to do when I went to college. And I remember being introduced to computer science as a major, as
Mm.
opposed to me just thinking like, oh, I've got this interest in
Yeah.
computers, but I also had interests in other things. And then recognizing like, wait, there are other people who have the same interest in
Yeah.
computers as
Yeah.
I do. And that was when I was like, oh, I'm really going to geek out and see like what this experience is about. And after that, everything's just been down this path of try some things, see what happens, make
Yeah.
some pivots along the way.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. And I appreciate you giving me a little bit of your history. And it's so funny to think, as you're talking, I'm hearing a lot of the same things, even though I had a completely different upbringing with you. Like, you lived in Brooklyn. I lived literally in the middle of nowhere, 10 kids graduating class, like very, very small, right? But the same thing. I grew up on food stamps, like trying to figure out that. And we got a computer on layaway, and we got it. Second day, I took it apart.
Yeah.
And my dad, I think similar disposition as your dad, just looked at me and said, "Fix this now." Right?
Yeah.
And I totally like feel the same things that you're talking about, right? Like the general curiosity. So here's a question for you. Like, have you always been naturally curious about everything? Like wanting to know how stuff works, or is it very specifically tied to technology?
No, it's a little bit of everything. And the sad part to it is I'm just now learning that it's a superpower. And I'll tell
Yeah.
you what I mean when I say that. Like I I remember being a kid hearing in school that because I couldn't draw, I wasn't artistic. And I'm
Yeah.
like, well, that's terrible. But then, and I this was probably like, 6, 7, 8 years old age.
Sure.
Then eventually I taught myself how to play the piano. And next thing you know, I'm
Mm.
like, oh no, I really am artistic. I
Yep.
just it looks different for me.
Yep.
But it's the same curiosity that leads me to end up learning how to cook. Now I'm doing all things DIY in my house because my house is 90 something years old. The same curiosity that's led me to try out different types of jobs in tech
Yep.
and recognizing like just because I work as in the industry doesn't mean I need to be a developer, but I
Yep.
could still be close to code. And so I think I'm a naturally curious person, and I'm literally in the last like 4 or 5 years learning how to lean into that to
Yep.
like find new strengths about myself. It's very interesting.
Yeah, it's wild. Like you mentioned something. I've talked this with a few people, and I think you probably agree. Like there is so much creativity that goes into technology, right? Like and we typically think of like, oh, are you left brain or right brain, or are you analytical or are you creative, right? And I've talked to enough people in tech that can draw, that are great with the arts, that can play music, like you said, piano. Like there are different ways to be creative. And I don't know about you, but like if I have to bang out some code for any reason and like I look at it afterwards, I'm like, chef's kiss, right? And then
Yeah.
like in 6 months, I'll look at it, I'm like, oh man, that's shit. That code is horrible. But like in the moment, it's like you've the elegant solution to solve a problem is a very creative thing. Problem solving is very creative, regardless of what I guess more typical ways of thinking think about it. So so here's a question for you then. Like you said that you've kind of recently realized that, being curious and being creative, like you've kind of come into this recently, right? So
Mhm.
what are some of the things you realized really quickly about yourself through this learning experience? Was it like you get a bit impatient, you get a bit OCD, like you want to like hyper fixate on things, be a master of things? Are you comfortable failing? Like these are some of the things that I think about a lot as somebody in tech who tries to do other non-tech things.
Yeah, the first thing for me, and there's a little bit of a socioeconomic thing to this, right?
Yeah,
Because
sure.
the first thing for me is like I've had to learn how to get comfortable taking risks.
Mm-hmm.
So, like in my curiosity, I end up trying to do things that I probably like shouldn't be doing, and they probably end up either costing me money,
Sure.
time, or energy, or some combination of the
Yeah.
three, right?
Mm-hmm.
And part of why I bring up the socioeconomic piece is because growing up the way that we did, I wasn't encouraged to do as much of this, right?
Yeah.
So there's a learned behavior around like, stay in your lane, don't
Mm-hmm.
push too far, that I'm
Yeah.
learning I have to break in order to tap into this curiosity even more. The best example I'll give is I'm trying to build closets in my house right now for my kids.
Yeah.
And anyone who owns a home or who's been in a really old home can probably tell you this is true. None of the walls are straight.
Nope.
None of the floors are level. Like
Mm-mm.
if something measures 12 inches or 12 feet on one side, it's probably 11 and something on the other. Right.
Yeah.
And so you look on YouTube and you watch these creators, these content creators who are like, yeah, just build a closet in a weekend. And then you come in your house, you're like, this isn't going to work.
Yeah.
And so I've been doing this now for the last year where we've been trying to figure out, all right, well, what size do I need on that side? And what size do I need on the right side? And how do I fix the ceiling? Because the ceiling isn't flush.
Yeah.
But
I
as I
mean,
learn, I'm tapping into new skills.
yeah, like you go to a new place, like maybe you're moving to a new place and you're looking at places, like you bring a ball and you put the ball in the center of the floor and just like, all right, which way does it roll, right? Because the floor isn't flat, right?
That's
Like
right.
stuff like that is like, and a real estate agent or like somebody will look at you like you're insane, but it's like, no, like if I'm gonna be living here for a year minimum, I want to know like, you know, if I drop something, like if I spill something, which way do I got to clean first, right? Like
Yeah.
there's some of the things that I've started to think about, like, you know, especially like your thing with old houses is really funny because I used to live on the East Coast, and now living on the West Coast, you really don't deal with like super old houses as much. Like you do like in some spots, but not like whatever. Like
Yeah.
when I lived in New York, I lived in a brownstone, like the basement of a brownstone. Funny enough, like if you've ever seen the Spike Lee movie Jungle Fever, I lived in that
Mhm.
house.
Okay.
Like,
Yeah, I
yeah,
know where
yeah.
that house
So
is
yeah,
actually.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So like I used to live in that house, and like the studio in the music studio, like where the movie takes place, like where they're doing the music, like that used to be my kitchen. There's just like random stuff,
Yeah.
right? But like you see like these houses have these different evolutions of stories, right? And I love how that equates to kind of what you're saying is you're in this journey now of like learning new things about yourself, right? Like, oh, like woodworking is something me personally I've always wanted to do, right? And you say you're
Yeah.
building closets, so immediately envious. Let me ask you a question, and if you don't want to answer it, it's cool. Do you have a really hard time with money? Like, do you like you can't have money in your pocket because it's gonna get spent or are you more of the like everything has to like we're hoarding everything. I live very frugal. Like which way do you typically lean? Because I think people that grew up not with a ton of money, they either are like me and they spend irrationally,
Yep.
or they're terrified of spending money. Period.
Yeah, I'm terrified of spending money and there's never enough, right? Like,
Yeah.
and the thing about working in tech, and I'm going to say this, it's going to come from a very privileged place. So I'm going to
Sure. No.
apologize if folks hear that privilege and think that there isn't authenticity behind it. But the thing about tech is we make a lot of money in really short periods of time. And I think about
Yes.
this like compared to like a teacher. Like I have two kids
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and I know my kids' school, they're always doing fundraisers because they
Hmm.
can always use more money.
Yeah.
Like working in tech and my barometer for money, it's very different than like what my kids' teachers are going through is they're like, how do we get supplies for the classroom? Versus I'm like, well, just place an Amazon order. Right. So
Yeah.
every now and again I have
Yeah.
to reconcile that sort of classist sort of point of view. But at the same time, I'm always like, look, what can we do to save more money? Because there's never enough.
Yeah, here's a trip that I go through a lot, and you probably have a similar experience, right? Like my first job out of college in tech, right? I was like 50K a year. And when you're like in your early 20s, you're like 50K, like dang, that's a lot of money,
Yeah.
like whatever. And
Yeah.
like now, I'm in my mid 30s and I'm like, how did I survive on $50,000 a year, right? And I
Yeah.
know that's like a horrible thing to say, right? Because that's like around like the median income in this country is. There's tons of people that are living way below that. And but like tech, good, bad, or indifferent, has kind of groomed us to like a specific lifestyle because there's so much money. I
Yeah.
also talk about this a lot, as somebody who, at one point in time this year was like not employed, like looking for work, right?
Yeah.
Like the risk that we pay with tech is that we get paid really well, but there's no stability in our job.
That's
Like
right.
any point in time, 9 times out of 10, you're working for a company that is a vendor for another company. And when the economy starts to get weird, like what's the first thing that companies do? They tighten budgets, they cut vendors, they do whatever, and that makes vendors, big companies, big tech companies, small tech companies, contract.
Yes.
Restructure organizationally, whatever you want to call it, right? So like the tech industry is hyper dependent on the overall industry because our customers will typically be like, I don't want you anymore, like get out of here. And then you get to a point in time, you saw that with the recession, with the pandemic, right? Like all tech blew up,
Yeah.
right? And now that
Yeah.
over the last year, 18 months, like it's the we've gone back to like normal. And all these tech companies that
Yeah.
are hyper bloated are like, oh, we gotta cut costs now, right? And it's crazy to think like that's the trade off that we have, like make a ton of money, but the job stability in a lot of cases just isn't there.
Yeah, this is where I think being, and I'm going to point specifically to the being a developer, but I think this is
Yeah.
true for many roles in tech where like you can ship code.
Mm-hmm.
This is where I look at being a developer pretty similarly as like someone who's a contractor who's doing
Yeah.
woodworking on a house. I like there will be the seasonality to when your skills are in
Sure.
demand.
Yeah.
And I talked about this actually on a podcast with Scott Hanselman, where we talked about the
Mm-hmm.
longevity of a career. And one of the things that I said was, if you have to constantly be paying attention to what's happening around you,
Yeah.
because if you don't, then you don't recognize how you need to be sharpening your skills
Yeah.
to continue to stay relevant. It's a
Yeah.
hard juggle. It's a very hard balance. And even in a scenario of tech where there's all this risk that you take with your career in terms of just being in the industry, and then people keep telling you like, and take more risk, like
Yeah. Yeah.
get
Yeah.
new jobs, switch
Yeah.
companies, right?
Learn
And
new
so all of a sudden
things.
you're looking around and you're
Yeah.
seeing this.
Like do this Kubernetes thing. Like it's the most important thing ever. Like everybody do Web3 now. Now we're all in
Right,
AI world, right? Like,
right.
you know, if and I joke with people a lot, right? Like you have to be very, very careful as to like what things you learn. It's important to always be learning, don't get me wrong, but you can
Yeah.
spend 6 months of your life learning something that literally is going to be thrown away, right?
Yep.
And that's part of the thing. But, I would love to get your thoughts too. Is like you kind of have to have like your core areas of interest. Like,
Yeah.
when did you realize, like, in which like types of technologies you were interested in? When did you realize? When did you start to like kind of attach yourself to certain areas of technology, knowing that you've kind of hopped
Oh,
around, knowing that you've kind of tried different things? When did you realize, like, oh, like this particular thing is what I'm interested in? I'll take jobs adjacent to this sort of work.
yeah. For me, it goes to all things .NET. This is like the easy to
Yeah.
answer this because for full context, right? Like I went to undergrad, shout out to Howard University,
Yeah.
HU.
Yeah.
Um, I went to undergrad at a time when like trying to get a job in the industry required more people in the room to look like me, even if
Mm.
I still had the skills, right?
Yeah.
And so um, I remember when I did my very first internship at Microsoft, which was God, 2005 or 2006.
Sure.
And I remember walking in the door, understanding and knowing C, C++, and Java, and them coming and saying, "Yeah, we need you to learn C sharp." That was my
Sure.
very first experience where I realized, wait a minute, my skills may need to change, and I may
Mm-hmm.
need to be able to pick up things on the fly.
Yeah.
Luckily, C sharp and Java look like cousins, so it was
Sure.
really
Yeah.
easy for me to pick that up. But after I started doing C sharp, I realized how much more pleasurable of an experience it was for me. Like
Yeah.
literally, it was very easy for me to get up and going with it. And I wanted to build more. And so the more I wanted to, the more I built. And the more I built, the more I was like, well, what else can we do? And it's one of the reasons why I love the .NET ecosystem. I like
Yeah.
completely am transparent about that because it's one of the very few ecosystems that you can use to build almost anything in tech.
Yep.
But that being said, like what I then came to learn was, okay, well, I have these skills and I need to go find jobs that match that.
Yep.
And what was fascinating to me once I was finishing up undergrad was I could get jobs in New York, I could get jobs in on the West Coast, I could get jobs in Chicago, specifically just with both that skill set and the experiences I'd had to date. And that was when I was like, all right, well, I need a job. I'm just going to go do this thing and let's go write some more C sharp.
Sure.
And then my jobs changed, which was interesting. That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be transparent too. Like, I very much have tried to learn other languages, and C sharp has been the only one that I've been comfortable in for a good amount of time. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And people that have listened to this podcast have heard me ad nauseum talk about how much I love C sharp, and it's not worth the conversation now. Um, but like one thing that's it's interesting to me specifically in your case is like, and we can delve into this. I'm very curious as somebody who does not look like you. Let's just call it out.
Yeah,
Like going to Howard, right? Like, most people look like you and don't look like me, right? So,
yeah.
what is the kind of the thought of getting jobs in tech at, HBCUs or schools like Howard, where, you know, this is not the worst, this is not the best way to say it, but like, these are jobs that typically aren't available for folks in certain, like, there are certain demographics. Like, what was your
Yeah.
experience in that? Like, I'd imagine, like, obviously they have a computer science department. They probably have an information systems department. They have tons of alumni that are in the space. But like, what was the experience like in computer science, in technology at one of those universities?
Yeah, there's a cheat code to this, right? And I'm
Sure,
going to say this in a way that I think is a little bit broad.
sure.
What I learned at Howard that I didn't know before wasn't explicitly stated was go get an internship. And I
Yeah,
promise you, like, this is one of those lessons that is it's still relevant today, but over time it's becoming less and less relevant, which
sure.
was if you were in a computer science program that was of any good, it was preparing you to enter the job market.
Yeah,
And if it was preparing you to enter the job market, the best test of that was not actually did you get an interview? It was did you pass the interview?
yeah, yeah.
And so at that time, um, I'm very fortunate for a gentleman who is very much still a mentor for me by the name of Mario Pipkin, who I'm actually hoping to see in a few weeks. Because Mario was at Microsoft as a general manager, he's the first person who I saw from Microsoft to make me think like, oh my God, you could succeed here as an
Yeah.
engineer, right? And so what I think about a ton is like two things happened at the same time. One is I had this interest in curiosity.
Hmm.
That's me doing the work. And the second is, and I had the circumstance to meet some specific people, one of them being
Sure.
Mario, who helped propel me forward. And so, what being at Howard sort of just continued to expose me to is like, no matter what, you got to get the internship,
Yeah.
do what you need to do, find that hustle and that grit. There
Hmm.
is no complaining. Like,
Yeah.
things won't always go your way. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Suck it up. Go do the thing to get the job. It looks very different now because there's boot camps. Like boot camps weren't
Yeah.
around when I was an undergrad.
Sure.
Or accelerators, right? Where I'm sorry, not accelerators, apprenticeships. Apprenticeships weren't around in tech when I was trying to get a job. Now I'm starting to see a little bit more of them, though with the economy, they've somewhat dwindled
Sure.
down. But I think this is where if anyone was trying to get into tech, I would say parts of this journey is gonna suck. And yes, you have to embrace the suck.
Yeah. It's I think the having to deal with a little bit of pain is like one of the core tenets of being in tech, right?
Yep.
Regardless of like where the pain is coming from, I think that there is just a like the job at times can seem very easy. And I don't like using the word easy, but I'm going to use it here. But sometimes it can feel really, really challenging, right? Like
Yeah.
we've all gone through situations where, we've had tons of obstacles and we've had to kind of work through them, whether they're obstacles that we can control, like, oh, I can't get this app to build, or there's also things like we can't control, like, oh, I got like a shit manager, right?
Yeah.
Like there are all sorts of things that we have to navigate. And I think it's very interesting in tech when you talk to people that are getting started, no one tells a lot of people that there's a lot of pain in tech. People see like oh, you're on Twitter all the time. Oh, you're making all this money. Like you're doing all these cool things. It's like, no, there's a lot of unfortunateness to the work too. But I think, and
Yeah.
I'm guessing you're a very similar feeling that I have, is like the pain is worth it because like the feeling of doing the right thing and getting the thing done like feels so damn good that like everything else just does not matter. All you want to do is get that little dopamine drip, like that endorphins of like doing the thing, getting it done.
Yeah, the pain of like I'll never forget. uh, I worked on a project at Microsoft that I don't know how much I can talk about publicly, so I'm going to
Sure.
be really careful. But we had a project, and I was the test lead on that project. It was very early in my career. Just started somewhat managing like projects at that level, and somewhat to some extent people. And we had shipped this thing, and this was before the cloud. So we had to like copy bits over and
Yep.
do certain things to do deployments. And if you messed around and got one thing wrong, like you could take down a whole system for a
You
bunch of
found
people around
out,
the world
right? Yeah, you found
very
out.
quickly.
Yeah.
And sure enough, this is what happened to us.
Yeah.
We shipped it. Everyone celebrated on a Thursday. We do no Friday deployments. Friday night at like 11 p.m. or like 2 a.m. in the morning, I get a phone call and it's, hey, we need you to fix this problem. And I'm like, wait, what? And sure enough, like the highs and lows of that entire experience are one of the most like memorable, fearful moments of my career because I was
Yeah.
super early in my career. I was still incredibly excited and not as jaded as I am now, even though I
Sure.
still love my job in tech. And I remember now looking back on that, saying like, that's a good lesson I think most people should go through. Right? Like
Yeah.
like I really do think you should understand what it is to both experience the highs of shipping and the lows of when things break.
Yeah, I think everybody that's of our similar age has like that I deleted the production database story,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Yeah, like, and I feel, and I, this isn't the best way to phrase it. I almost feel kind of bad for people that are getting started in tech now. There are so many guardrails, right?
Yeah.
Like, DevOps is a huge thing now. There's tons of what different like advanced securities and different mechanisms built into systems that like, oh, like if you deploy a bug, you know about it almost immediately, right?
Yes.
There's not very many situations, you know what happens? I think a lot of it is in the data breach side where, oh, like stuff went bad very, very quickly and you found out, right? But yeah, I love whenever those threads kind of show up on Twitter. It's like, oh, it makes me feel so good knowing that I'm not the only person who failed miserably at one point in my career. Um,
One,
so yeah, go ahead.
I'll just throw one thing out there too, which is part of what I love about tech, and this is probably like my like curious brain, like going too far,
Hmm.
is the ways in which these failures occur continue to evolve.
Yes.
And so a really good example is obviously like I work at Okta, we work in the identity space. Social engineering to try to like break into
Sure.
applications is a thing.
Yep.
And how you try to make sure that you protect yourself, like you're going to do your best effort, understanding that what is best effort today will probably not be the same as best effort 6 months from now.
Yeah.
It is fascinating to me.
Yeah, it's yeah. There's and technology moves so darn fast too. Like
Yes.
we were talking about like different technology trends over even like the last year, like things that have showed up. They're gonna take over, revolutionize tech, and then like people don't really care about them anymore.
Yeah.
One of the thing, kind of going back to your career progression a little bit is like, I'd love to get your experience when you got that first job, right? Like you show up, you're excited, like lunch pail, like I'm gonna go solve all the problems, right? Like what was some of the things that you realized really quickly, the assumptions that you made about working in tech that were just
Mhm.
completely wrong?
There's a lot about when people get that first job, you hear a lot of advice like try to solve problems, try to
Sure.
find low hanging fruit,
Yeah.
right? Like the one problem that the team has neglected, it
Yeah.
probably could be really interesting for you. And there's a lot that's wrong about that advice. That's not to say it's not good advice. It's more to say, as you settle into the job, give yourself time to settle
Mm-hmm.
because so much of it is new and you won't know how much is new until like 6 to 9 months down the line, if we're being
Yeah.
really honest.
Sure.
Um, I remember the first time I got a job at Microsoft. I remember the second time I went back for my first day at Microsoft. I remember the first day at the federal government because I used to be a developer for the IRS.
Oh, okay.
Um, and those are three very different
Sure,
experiences,
sure. Yeah.
right? And even now, like being at Okta, I was at Twilio, I was at a number of other companies and some nonprofits. You just those first day experiences force you to really humble yourself and be like, okay, I have a certain set of skills,
Hmm.
but why did they really hire me? Right? Like,
Yeah, yeah,
I don't really know why they said yes to me. So figuring some of that out, taking some of that
yeah.
time in those first few weeks, really, or months, is a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that we're starting to go down this path now in tech where, when I first got started, I imagine you're the same way. It's like, oh, we're looking for self-starters, hit the ground running, be successful immediately, right? And like that puts so much pressure on somebody to not just like learn how to do a job, but like learn how to work at a company, learn how to work with people, whatever. And now I'm seeing more and more like, okay, like we're not going to give you any work when you get started. Because your first
Yeah.
couple of weeks, like you should learn all the different systems of this company, learn the processes, learn the acronyms, learn the org chart, like all these things that honestly, like if you just hit the ground running and you like day one, like, oh, here are your user stories, go work, right? You don't ever get a chance to go and do those things, right?
Yeah. I'm managing someone who's just joined the team in July, I think, July or August. We literally about an hour ago we're just finishing finally polishing up their here's what I think I want to do this fiscal year,
Mm,
right? And I like I'm looking at that and saying to myself, okay, I'm seeing the right progress. You're asking the right questions. These are good signals that you've gotten off to a decent start. And
yeah,
then sort of in the back of my mind now, I'm also like, what else do I need to do to help unlock your potential?
yeah.
Right. But now I'm a manager. So I'm thinking a ton about these types of questions more regularly than when I was in other roles where I would spend more time thinking about either how to write code or how to connect with
Yeah.
developers writing certain bits of code.
Yeah, when did you realize, and this is something that we talked about this a little bit before we got started, like something that I still haven't like gotten super comfortable with, even though I've had to do it in the past, like the idea of like managing people. Like when did you realize that like managing people was either something that you had an interest in, something that you were good at, something that you wanted to be better at? Like when
Mhm.
did you first realize that was something?
Um, I'm going to answer that in two ways. The
Sure.
first is I got the opportunity to manage people when I was at Microsoft. Like, I'm going to call this 2010, 12, somewhere back there.
Sure.
Right. And that was early enough in my career that I still didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, it was one of those experiences where you sort of say, okay, we've kept the lights on. I think I've done my job. And that I thought was like, now looking back on it, is the wrong answer. And then I realized very recently, closer to about 2019, 2020, while I was at Twilio, I was doing developer relations there. And I realized that I wanted to have um, more aha moments with
Hmm.
people as
Yeah.
opposed to like just through the developer relations work that I was doing. And
Hmm.
so I started to try to find opportunities where I was doing more influencing of my peers as opposed to having to just be responsible for delivering a particular outcome for the business. And I realized like part of why I got into developer relations was I love the aha moments
Yeah.
for that, where like you teach someone something and then it sparks something in them and then they just go do. I
Yeah.
live for those moments.
Yeah.
And in joining or transitioning into management, that is truly a discipline. Like there is a bunch of art around it and there's some science to it.
Yeah.
But figuring out what that looks like for me has been, I think, the most fascinating part of my career. Obviously, I'm biased because I'm doing it right now.
Sure, sure. Yeah, maybe we'll chat again in like a couple of years when you're back to being an IC and you're like, "Oh, I can never be a manager again." But
That's
like for
exactly
a
right.
moment, it's good to hear that you're enjoying it because I think some people like this is going to be a spicy take. I think some people get into management for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
Um like I think you definitely need a particular mindset. That's why I personally kind of have this struggle of actually wanting to do it because like I don't know if I have the right temperament or whatever, right? Some people they see management as an opportunity to climb the ladder
Yep.
or take on more responsibility or kind of be able to aggregate your team's work and not take credit for it but help it amplify your own station, all these sort of things, right? um,
Yeah.
and I'd love to that kind of transitions this little conversation I want to have about, how you measure success for yourself versus success for the people that you're responsible for a management perspective, right? We talked about this a little bit before we got started about like how not everybody is the same mold because that would be really boring if it was. So
Hmm.
not only do you need to worry about your own career, but you need to worry about the career of your team and
Yep.
also the the sanctity of your org, because that's a thing too that a lot of people I think miss out is like if you're not like proving your case, there's an
Yeah.
opportunity for you to no longer be in existence, right?
Yeah. Yeah. This is one where I actually spend a lot of time thinking about this. If I'm being really honest. And a good example is yesterday I was talking to the team about ways we can better connect with developers where they are
Mm-hmm.
because I'm I have sort of three things always in the back of my mind. One is, well, what am I doing to help the team continue to do or start to do their best work, right?
Yep.
The second is, and how can I make sure that that work ties back to what the business cares about? And then the third is, and where am I in that mix?
Yeah.
And those three questions are always for everything that we do. I have to have an answer to those three things. My
Yeah.
team may not always see that, right? Like sometimes they'll feel it, sometimes they won't. But I'm always asking those three questions,
Mm-hmm.
especially in developer relations, where the traditional sort of mantra is, well, we don't have success metrics.
Yeah.
And so I almost want to like I think DevRel is in an interesting state given where the industry is headed and where the economy is headed. And so I almost want to break that mantra because I think you
Sure.
can pick some success metrics that the business should care about
Mm-hmm.
and do the work to validate why and how and demonstrate the importance there. But for me as a manager, what I'm thinking about for my own success is how much are we evolving to move towards what the business needs
Yeah.
and growing the team, right? Because like if you took me out today and the team still functioned as they did, then obviously I didn't have a place. There was no need for
Sure.
me to be there.
Yeah.
And I don't want that. I want my work to truly be that because I was there, we made a difference in how we were able to drive specific outcomes for our company.
Yeah, I mean that's a great way to think about it. I do push back a little bit because like tech in general likes to have like this idea of like everyone is replaceable, right?
Yeah.
Like you were
Yeah.
like, oh, we can replace literally anybody and the
Yeah.
cog will keep rolling. Like it might be a little uneven for a bit, but it'll eventually recorrect itself, right? How do you like with the mindset of like if I was to leave or get removed, like everything falls apart. How do you
Mhm.
instill faith in your teams that that's not going to happen? Because I think that's something that from a culture perspective could be quite dangerous, right? Like, I could only imagine like other people in the company or even on your team is like, man, if Corey was gone, like that's not good. Like you want that because you want to like bring success and like be important and impact and all those cliche things, but like you also don't want people to feel dependent on you.
Yep. Yeah, this is I was just talking to a number of folks because I do career conversations with everyone on my team once a month, every month, right? And one of the conversations, or my team will say that I like to say this a lot because they've started to call out my Coreisms, which I love. But one of the things I always tell them is like, if I'm doing my job well, you should probably not be in the same role or even be at the company in the next like 3 to 5 years, right?
Sure.
Like to me, the definition of success isn't that you've helped the business succeed. Sure, that's part of it. But really, it's are you getting what you need to succeed as an individual and doing it in a way where the business is getting what it wants?
Yeah.
And so if I think about my importance, it shouldn't be that I'm necessarily needed to do my function in
Yeah.
order for us to succeed, which is why I'm always like, how can I train up my number two? It's
Hmm.
why I'm pulling in folks that are what I would call my senior most individuals into conversations of a strategic nature, such that if I did leave, the team absolutely understood the direction
Hmm.
and could then say, here's where we would go or how we would pivot. It is also why I believe in having a strong leadership team. And
Yeah.
I say this like I have one of the best co-leads in the industry and in my co-lead, Anna Cedre. I have one of the best managers in my VP, Cliff Simpkins. Like I fundamentally believe in my peers and Tony and Sam. Like we have such an amazing leadership team that I think if one of us was to need to step away, the others would step in and easily fill
Yeah.
some of that gap. And that's important.
Yeah. That's great. And there's something that you said that I loved hearing it, like the 3 to 5 year conversation, right? Because I think there's this, I don't know if it's an old sociological thing with working where it's like, oh, if you hop around, if you look at a resume and there's like 10 companies on it, right?
Yeah.
Like what's wrong with you? like
Yeah.
like are you chasing money? Are you hard to work with? Are you always looking for something better, right? I, and I've always had this thing. I had a conversation with a manager one time where they asked me like, "What's your 3 year plan? What's your
Mhm.
5 year plan?" And I'm like, "I don't even know what I'm doing in like 9 months, let alone like 3 years. Like I don't have no idea. For all I know, in 3 years, this org is gone. I'm out of a job. This technology that I've been using my entire career no longer exists anymore. Like things happen, right?"
Yeah.
And I love the way that you're thinking is like there is instability in
Yes.
tech in a way that like you have to you it's hard to think 3 years 5 years out because at the end of the day like you made it the point very clear. If we're doing the same thing 3 years from now and we haven't grown, like what value are we really bringing? Not to say that you need to get promoted like every year or every 2 years or
Right.
whatever it is, but like you need to be showing personal and professional growth. And whether that's taking on extracurriculars like working like maybe there's groups in your company that you can be a part of to help drive their mission. Maybe it's taking on extra responsibilities. It all these things don't have to be with the outcome of like, oh, I'm gonna get a promo or I'm gonna get a raise or whatever, because I
Right.
think a lot of it too is about your growth. And look, if you're happy in a job for 5 years, that's cool. Like,
Yeah.
but there probably will be a point in time where you are doing the same thing and you'll get a bit stagnant. So here's a question for you then, like, you've been doing this thing for long enough, right? Like, have you run into situations in your career where you just kind of got bored and you're like, I
multiple
gotta
times.
do something new? Like, this is, I'm kind of going like this when I start
Yeah.
work every day. Like, and
Mhm.
what did that look like for you? And what were some of the things you did to kind of mitigate that?
Yeah, I would tell you. I mean, and this this ties really nicely back to my superpower thing, right? Because
Yeah,
the clearest indicator for me where boredom is setting in has nothing to do with work. So I'm going to give like the
sure.
easiest example, and I'm going to show you how it shows up in my workday. Um, I change my living room like once every 6 to 8 months.
Mm,
And I know this sounds incredibly crazy. Like people are probably like, what? Like I literally will rearrange the furniture. I'll get new plants. I'll get new lights. I'll get a different lamp fixture. I will change my living room every six to
mm,
eight months. And what I'm what I'm learning about myself in this way, because I've always done this, even since when I was
yeah,
in college, which was ridiculous. But what I'm learning about myself in this process is there's something about stability that feels uncomfortable to me. So when I end up in a job where like, hey, I get off to a great start and then things sort of hit a rough patch, but I use that as a lean in opportunity to grow and learn. And then I sort of get to a point where I realize I'm wanting to do something different. I need to pay attention to that. For too long in my career, I haven't paid attention to it. And so there have been times where like I'll stay at a company because either I really like the money or I somewhat like the people or I
sure. Yeah.
somewhat like the problem space. And I'm not paying attention to the fact that, but I really want to go try something else. And this itch is getting a lot louder.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's the same reason why I ended up stepping away from my last company.
Mm-hmm.
I got into a point where I recognized I really wanted to have a different type of impact.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that anything was wrong with the company or that the opportunity wasn't there. It was to say I thought the best way for me to do that was to leave.
Yeah.
And I am 100% a proponent of that. Like
Yeah.
one there are times where you need to leave companies.
Yeah, I gotta ask a question though about the moving the house around, moving the living room around. You live in an old house. I know you
Yeah.
only got one wall you can put a TV on, so you don't move the TV, right? Like that's a
I didn't
thing.
put the TV on the wall for that reason.
Oh, there we go. There we go. There we go. Yeah, like it's funny. Like I think our friend Scott Hanselman had a thread on Twitter some time ago about like who puts like their TV above the mantle, and it's like sometimes that's the only wall it can go on, man. Anyway,
That's right.
so like, but I like the idea of kind of causing disruption in your life, like in a healthy way. I
Yeah.
think in general, we as humans don't really enjoy change very well. Like I don't say like I used to say we fear change. I kind of have repositioned that to like we don't enjoy change because we're
Yeah.
so used to our comforts and the comforts is what makes us feel safe and anthropologically blah 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 we want us to be safe. But the idea that like you're making a thoughtful act of just causing a little bit of disruption to your day. Whereas like, if you're on autopilot, you go to sit on the couch and you land on the floor, right? Like, keeping your brain active for different stimuli. And I think that, you know, they say like, oh, if you step away from a problem, it'll just come to you as you're going on a walk or taking a shower or whatever. And I totally believe that because in my career, I've had so many situations where I've like been somewhere and I'm like,
Mhm.
oh, I know this, I know how to solve that problem now. And I'm like looking around trying to find like something to write on or text something to myself or whatever because I know by the time I get home, I'm gonna forget it. Right.
Well, I, I, I just had this yesterday in a team meeting where one of our colleagues, the amazing Ciora Ford, is working on this project that I can't exactly talk about, but it
Sure.
uses Next.js. And she goes, I'm struggling with this one problem. And I said, yeah, and the answer will probably come to you in the middle of the night.
Yep.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
as a developer, there are moments where we all have these aha things where
Yeah.
the answer to a bug or a technical problem just comes to you. And
Yep.
next thing you know, you just got to get it out of your head.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say that it happens to every developer, but it is to say that it shows up differently to
Mm-hmm.
everyone for different types of problems. You'd be surprised.
Yeah, I completely agree with the that some people will say like some problems aren't solvable. I
Right.
think that if a problem isn't solvable, your approach is probably not the best, right?
Yeah.
one of the things I would love to kind of transition to a little bit is we've talked about a bit about like developer relations in general. And with
Mhm,
developer relations, there, at least how I see it, there's kind of two main like tenets of a role, right? The want to educate people
mhm.
and the want to raise awareness. And you could say those two things are kind of similar, but when did you realize that developer relations, like the engagement of the community, the education aspect of tech was important to you?
I have always been a teacher. Me and
Yeah.
Scott actually talked about this a little bit. I can't remember if it made his podcast, but I've always like even if you look at my LinkedIn, you'll see there's teaching experience at the
Yeah.
very start of my
Sure.
career. And the reason why is because what I've now accepted. I've always enjoyed seeing people get it,
Yeah.
right? Like if you say something and they're looking at you and then you see like that moment where it
Mm-hmm.
connects. And specifically when it comes to software, there is a racial and socioeconomic aspect to it for
Sure.
me because um as we shared before, I've gone to Howard. It's very easy to find folks who look like me in the classroom. You step outside of Howard, all of a sudden it was a lot harder. And so one of my personal missions has always been to connect more folks who look like me
Yeah.
in all things tech. And so as I started like doing more of this, I did a little bit of it at Microsoft. I did more of it personally. What really opened my eyes to it was joining Twilio. I joined
Mm.
Twilio in 2000 and late 2016, I believe, because it was right before my son was born. And I remember um, really leaning into the why. Like,
Yeah.
why was that important? Why is it that we wanted people to be excited about building software? At Twilio, obviously, there was always the question of why do you want to do this with Twilio? But I
Yeah.
remember leaning into that start with the why principle and philosophy, and it changing my life for how I think about DevRel. So even when um, people ask me why did I join Okta, I often say because identity is hard, and I don't
Yeah.
think it needs to be. It's
Yeah.
that simple.
Yeah. We've talked about this like when you and I have seen each other in person, right? Like
Mhm.
there is nothing that can be more frustrating for folks than like just trying to get identity to work, right? And if it could just be a little bit simpler, and simpler is not
Yep.
even the best word. If it could be just a bit more approachable, it would bring so much more value to the developer experience. I think one thing too that you said is really important, and I attach myself to it as well. Like, that you engage with somebody and they get it. They might not
Yep.
know all of the pieces, but like you see it if you're presenting on stage or if you're talking to somebody at a conference or even if you're like doing content that people consume later, right? If they comment in it or whatever, like that moment where they realize like this isn't magic, like I can do this myself, right? Because I think that there's so much. This is good and bad about tech. Like a lot of things, people assume you have to be a superhero to be able to do, and
Yeah.
it's literally I've talked about this a lot. Like the way that you learn is different for depending on who you are and your upbringing and all sorts of things. And if you're trying to consume learning content a particular way that doesn't work for you, it's going to be impossible for you to learn how to do that thing. So you find the
Yeah.
content type that works or the type of delivery. Like, maybe you're at a conference and you love the way Corey presents versus me. Like, that's totally cool. I would probably feel the same way. Um, but the thing is that's so important to your learning journey, right? Like, we had teachers in high school and primary school that we enjoyed more than others. If we went to college, we had professors that we enjoyed other than others because their delivery was different. Maybe the content of the class is different too, and you enjoyed that more. But
Yeah.
the things that I remember when I'm learning things is if I step away, I'm like, oh, is there like three or four things from this piece of content that I can go and learn more about? Because I think that it's a it I don't think there's any piece of content, and this is a bit of a rant, so I apologize. Like, there's not a
No, it's
piece of
cool.
content that has a start, a middle, and an end, and then you're done.
Yeah.
Like, you can have that piece of content have a start, middle, and end, but there needs to be something that leads on to the next thing. So when you're
Yeah.
building content, whether it's speaking or blogging or videos or whatever, right? Like, what are some of the ways that you try to intertwine that storytelling piece of it?
I think a ton about how I like to learn. And I
Mm-hmm.
love that you went in that direction because one of the first questions I tend to ask people very specifically when they tell me they want to get into tech is, well, how do you like to learn?
Yeah.
Like I can tell you to go to college, I can tell you to go to a boot camp, I can tell you go find free code camp, I can tell you go find free YouTube videos.
Mm-hmm.
None of that will matter if you prefer to sit down and read a book. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, one of the things that I think a ton about is how do I like to learn? Like, what is it that I enjoy? And I lean into that, which is why I live streamed on Twitch well before the pandemic
Mm-hmm.
because I just enjoy doing stuff with others. Right. But it for me underscores the larger point in my head, which is representation matters. And I
Yep.
say this all the time. It's not just about like racial representation or gender representation. There's also diversity of thought, and there's also variety in how folks learn and neurodivergence. And what does it mean to ensure that people feel like they see someone they can identify with and pick up that topic or that piece of content from? And so it is the reason why I am a big stickler of like especially in developer relations where it's really easy to do this. Everyone doesn't have to approach success the same way. We may measure it the same way, but how you get there can totally be individualistic to you and be celebrated in that way.
Yeah.
So I now as a manager, I get to try to figure out how to manage this. But on the other side, I'm like, look, I think this is a really fun problem to try to figure out.
And that's what's so wild about it too is like, if you're managing developer advocates, right? Each person has their own brand, each person has their own way of thinking, the type of people they like to present to or deliver content for, the type of content, whether they're a JavaScript developer, a .NET developer, or I like Kubernetes or whatever, right? Like, I think one thing that's really interesting whenever I've seen DevRel teams put together, it's
Mhm,
like, oh, like let's have one of each specialty.
mhm.
And I always look at that. I'm like, but is that really what you want? Like, do you want folks that are an individual brand promoting a company because they happen to work there? Or are you incorporating people that tell different points of view to a overall story?
Yeah.
And I think that's one thing, you know, I don't want to knock DevRel because you're in DevRel, I've been in DevRel. Like, I think at times we fall victim in DevRel to focusing too much on the stories we want to tell versus
Yeah.
the stories that need to be told.
Yep. This is a fundamental crisis that I think DevRel is reckoning with right now, if I'm
Mm-hmm.
being really transparent. I think it's a big part of why, like, I think folks are paying too much attention to the signals of, hey, someone was laid off, or
Mm-hmm.
alternatively, hey, this company has just gotten funding, but now they're cutting costs, and
Yep.
they're not focusing enough on the core problem, which is exactly what you mentioned. What are the things that needed to be done, and where was the gap between what was needed and where we were?
Yeah.
And so my sense is every DevRel program sort of goes through this evolution of there's going to be some core specialties, there are going to be some core things the business needs, and
Mm-hmm.
weaving back and forth between the two.
Yeah.
I don't actually think it's an either or question.
Yeah.
I think it's a both and. And my team will tell you one of my Coreisms is yes and. So it's
Mm-hmm.
one of those things where I'll say, yeah, I actually agree with that. And let's add to that, how do we make it real? Right? Like,
Yeah.
how do we turn this into something that is practical, applicable for how people do this work, gives people motivation to be excited to continue to stay engaged? Because yes, while we do get paid, we still want to feel fulfilled with the
Yeah.
work that
Of
we
course.
do and everything else that comes in between.
I think in general too, one thing that I've joked about this, like the title is terrible too. Like developer relations, like it sounds like you're an attorney, right? Like, and not to say that I know what the perfect title is. I
Yeah.
like developer experience is cool, but developer experience to me has always felt way more product oriented.
Yeah.
Um, you know, it's like it's dev storytelling. Like it's marketing, it's product, it's engineering. Like that's the reason why like every company you go to, like DevRel, if it's a centralized DevRel, it's all in different orgs. Some
Yep.
of them are in marketing, some of them are in product, some of them are in sales. Like it's very interesting because it's like the business's opinion as to like where's the best place to put these people that talk to developers or talk to
Yeah.
technologists, right? Which is kind of funny. Like you talk to a startup and like, maybe they have like 20 employees and they're all engineers and maybe a product person and maybe one growth marketer. And they're like, "Oh, we're going to hire our first DevRel person, our first developer advocate." And you talk to them and like, "Okay, what do you exactly want this person to do?" And then
I
they
have no
list
idea.
they list literally every job. And you're
Yep.
like, "Oh, so you want like one person to do six jobs. That's cool. What you really need is product marketing. What you really need is developer experience. What you really need is user experience." And then like, I've had the luxury of talking to some founders when I was looking for work about this particular world. And the look on their face is a combination of like, "Oh, and you don't know
Uh-huh.
what you're talking about, Isaac. Like, I know what I'm talking about because it's my business." Well, I was like, "Okay, well, that's fine." I think one thing that's really important to call out too is that there isn't a good place for DevRel because DevRel
Yeah.
really encompasses the entire business. I joke with people all the time, like, we're all in sales. Whether you're actually selling, whether you're writing code, we're all in
Yeah.
sales. We're all trying to make money, unless you work for a non-for-profit, and that's a whole different thing. So, with the thought of like the goal is always to make the business money or drive growth or whatever you want to call it.
Uh-huh.
Like, how do you navigate that? Because I think that's something that a lot of folks get really up in the weeds about. It's like, okay, the business wants us to do this one thing, but it's not the best thing for our audience. Or,
Yeah.
yeah,
I I have like two, maybe three thoughts here. My
sure.
first thought is people should always pay attention to where DevRel sits in the org because that tells you what the business needs from DevRel. And
Mm-hmm.
I always say that to say you can use that um as safety guards. You
Yeah.
can use that to say, because we sit in marketing and we're focused on marketing, here's how we want to define our success. Anything that comes outside of that, well, that may not be your area of expertise. And
Yeah.
it's okay for you to say, hey, this fits outside the box. I'm not sure that you want me to delve into that. That's one thing. And that I think helps to force the really difficult conversation of, well, where should DevRel be focused? But then there is the community aspect of DevRel. And
Yep.
this is where I think your question is much more interesting because what comes to mind for me is, as you said, we are in the business of trying to make money. While we may not necessarily know how to say, hey, you go sign on the dotted line so I can go get
Yep.
paid,
Yep.
we do know how to say, well, here's what's interesting to you as a developer. And
Yep.
that's a value conversation, regardless of what people think. And so if I were to say to you, hey, let's crack open Visual Studio right now, let's go install Auth0's template so we can go build a web application that's powered by Auth0 for
Yep.
identity. Now we've had a value conversation that you can then go take back to whomever you need to, who will help facilitate signing
Yes.
checks.
Yep.
And so I think we need to expand the way we think about success. It doesn't have to be that, well, I did A and that contributed to B, and now we have C as an outcome. It is
Mm-hmm.
truly like, well, we've had the conversation with you, and we know that you've got relationships with these other folks.
Yep.
And so we're happy to help build those relationships, which is why I get why relations is in the
Yep.
title, right?
Sure.
We're happy to help build those relationships while at the same time making sure that both of us succeed. Because my success may not necessarily be that you've purchased, but
Yep.
it does need to be that you've understood enough to be able to go purchase.
I totally agree. I think, and we talked about this a little bit, like the challenge of like defining success or quality or success metrics in DevRel, because I think it's all very clear, like Twitter engagement, YouTube views, like they're cool, but like they don't really, the business isn't going to look at those things and
Right.
say, "Oh, okay, how'd this turn into revenue?" And I
That's
think
right.
at the end of the day, like if you talk to some folks in the business, they're very tied to like, okay, how did this generate revenue? Oh, you don't
Right.
generate revenue, so you're in marketing? Okay, so how many leads do you have? Okay, do those
Right.
leads actually turn into revenue? Everything gets back to revenue, right? So,
Always.
yeah. And as we're wrapping up the conversation, like What do you see? Like, you've kind of hopped around this, and I'd love to get like your definitive thought. Like, what does the developer relations specialty look like over the next, I don't want to say 3 years because that's way too far in the future, but like in the next 6 months, in the next year? Are we going to see some movements into some of these areas where there's a less hyper focus on, business success metrics and more towards X? Or are
Yeah.
we going to continue to kind of hammer on the status quo until, the cyclical thing that we've been talking about just kind of reintroduces itself?
COVID disrupted the status quo, and
Sure.
I can't understate that enough. And so what I would encourage folks to think about as we look at how DevRel is evolving is truly, if the business does really need you to drive a number that's important to it, what's that number for you and your
Mm-hmm.
team or your program? It could truly be that we need eyeballs on the blog because we found that the blog drives sign up conversion.
Sure.
So let's go focus these efforts on writing blogs. It could alternatively be that we found that folks engage with us through things like GitHub
Mm-hmm.
and GitHub issues. So let's make sure we put the attention there. But my suggestion to folks is pay attention to where your business is paying attention to and
Yeah.
why that matters, and go put your efforts there. Because that doesn't mean that we can't continue to advocate for and on behalf of developers. It just needs to look different than how we thought about it to date, specifically because COVID disrupted all of the status
Yeah.
quo.
That's such an important point, is like there are things that are outside of our control that can completely change how we like. I mean, I say this all the time. 5 years ago, if you're in DevRel, you're getting on a plane like
Right.
3 times a month.
Right.
Now there's still DevRels that get on planes, right? But nowhere near the same uh, urgency as there was. I think you're seeing a little bit. I think too. I think there's still a lot. The recession being, or the economy being one thing, is like a lot of companies are not super interested about flying people around. Like there's green initiatives and things that are part of that too, which I think are very important. But like
Yep.
the necessity to like, you know, be Delta Diamond or
That's right.
Marriott, whatever, like that's not super important. Like that's not a benefit of being a DevRel person anymore, typically. This has been a great conversation, Corey. I've loved every bit of it, talking about some of the different social economic factors about being in tech, the area of kind of transitioning from individual contribution to being a manager, talking about DevRel. This has been great. And, as we wrap up, I love to ask my guests like one final question, and it's the hardest one you'll probably get. And the question is, if you can kind of think about the conversation that we've had, and your experience in tech and managing and developer relations and all these things we kind of talked about over the last hour, but you only had one word to describe how you would feel about the future of tech. What would that word be for you?
Humble. That's the first word
Humble.
that comes to mind.
That's good. That just shows that's just the kind of person you are, though. Like you're just a naturally humble person, which I envy because I love to talk about myself, man. Um, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate it. For folks that, if you're not already following Corey, I highly encourage you to do so. You can find them on Twitter X, at Corey L Weathers, CoreyLWeathers. There'll also be some links down to some different social places you can find Corey as well. Also, please check out Auth0, check out Okta, because they're doing some great things for the developer experience in the identity space, which I think, we talked about it a bit. It's highly needed. And with that, my friend, do you have any parting words before we sign off?
Man, just thank you for the opportunity. For those of you who'll be in San Francisco, you'll catch me at Octane next week. That's Okta's annual identity conference, which I'm very excited about. For those who haven't, we've got Octane Online coming up, and I'll be on there as well next week. So definitely check that out at okta.com/octane. And beyond that, I love having this conversation with you, Isaac. I always love when we get to connect. So thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, no worries. And thank you for shouting out Octane. So I'll be sure to put a link for the conference. So that's October 3rd through 5th of 2023. And they'll also put a link to some of the other stuff too. And this has been a great conversation. Thanks, folks, for tuning in live and listening to us in the future. My name is Isaac Levin. I've had a great time. For my friend Corey Weathers, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.